Between 1979 to 2024, productivity in the US soared by 80.9%, while hourly pay grew by just 29.4% during the same period.
The paychecks of typical workers have not grown nearly as fast as overall economic growth over the past 40 years.
In June 2024, two-thirds of middle-income households believed that their income was falling behind the cost of living.
I think that many Americans feel the financial struggle because their household budget and their household balance sheets are facing so much pressure.
Every time I check my local mom group on Facebook, I see requests or people asking where they can get some financial assistance to pay utilities or assistance with rent. And it's concerning because these people are working full-time jobs and they just can't make things work right now.
The issue of wage trends, wage suppression, it just could not be more central to what has happened to the middle class over the past couple of decades.
So what exactly is keeping the middle class from earning a higher paycheck?
That was already some pretty interesting information that they were sharing here. I think we had already covered previously kind of a recent segment on men and the workforce, and it also highlighted in that video from CNBC as well that folks with a bachelor's degree were actually seeing real wage growth over the last decade or more. And actually folks without a bachelor's degree or a college degree of some sort were actually seeing real wage loss when it was compared for dollar. Now compared to before. I think that was at least a 30 to 50 year span that they had compared that over. And so we're certainly seeing segments of the population today that are making less money in inflation adjusted dollars for what they might have been able to make 30, 40, 50 years ago. So this is already something that we're seeing at a segment of the population. So they're going to be discussing how kind of real wage growth isn't really there. I know for a number of folks, inflation has been out of control for quite some time. Obviously hitting 8+% at certain points over the last couple of years. And I'm sure many of us have had a conversation or heard of a conversation to the effect of, well, my raise at work wasn't 8-10% over that same period of time. Maybe I got a 0% raise, maybe a 1-2-3% raise. Meanwhile, inflation is 8-9-10%. And so I know that's definitely been top of mind. I've seen that for folks who work for me and folks that I work with, as well as other folks that I know working at other companies, that is a real scenario that you're actually able to see live. You can see it, you see the inflation reports, and you see how much your employer is paying you. Or even in some cases, maybe there's some folks who are laid off or something along those lines. So certainly we're seeing this real time with a number of segments already. So curious how they're going to back this up and like what time frame they're going to be looking at here.
I think people think inflation is a policy problem, but wages are my problem. And it turns out wages are not just your problem. Wages are entirely a policy and political variable.
The main goal of policymakers at the Federal Reserve is to ensure maximum employment while keeping prices stable. They rely on various economic data to guide their decisions, including the natural rate of unemployment.
Economists produce this thing they call the natural rate of unemployment. It's like the lowest unemployment can go without generating inflation.
Throughout history, the natural rate of unemployment has hovered between 4.5% and 5.5%.
And then we look at actual unemployment and how often it is above that estimate of the natural rate versus below. And if you look at the years since 1979, we have spent far more time with actual unemployment well above that estimate of the natural rate.
Between 1949 and 1979, the actual unemployment rate was cumulatively 15.3% below the natural rate of unemployment. In contrast, the unemployment rate was cumulatively 35.7% above the natural rate of unemployment between 1979 and 2017. This has real-world consequences for the American middle class, because wages tend to grow faster during periods when unemployment is low. The Economic Policy Institute estimates that just a 1 percentage point drop in unemployment leads to wage growth of 0.4 to 0.9 percentage points for workers near the median of the wage distribution.
The best bargain.
So something that they're covering here is how unemployment kind of impacts real wage growth. Um, they might be getting towards this in a second here, but some aspect of this, again, is I think going back to supply and demand, which is obviously going to be a recurring theme for financial matters. And so, in this scenario where when employment is low, usually speaking, this is where there's a lot of incentive for the employee at this point in time. And so, if you find there's a lot of work and work that you enjoy and work that you feel like you're appropriately compensated for, you're going to be more likely to take that job. And so this at scale means the economy is doing quite well and there's a lot of growth happening in the economy. And then therefore businesses are paying more for employees or incentivizing employees to work for them because they believe growth is coming. And so certainly these things would be correlated in so much as unemployment dropping, like something that we've seen in a variety of sectors over the last couple of years, is as the employers have less confidence that they're going to gain growth, they're going to incentivize their employees less and there's less competition. So when things get tough, there's going to be less jobs available. And then similar to kind of the housing market where we've just seen recently, um, prices have gone pretty crazy over the last couple of years. This is because there's fewer houses, but there's still a good chunk of folks who are looking for homes compared to how many homes are there to be purchased. And so a similar factor would come into play for employment and salaries, which is if there's a lot of jobs, then the way you stand out as an employer is to give more benefits or higher wages so that people come to you. And in a scenario where there aren't that many jobs or businesses are struggling, generally speaking, then they're going to probably pay less for their employees, or maybe they're going to lay off more employees. And then this leads to more folks who are unemployed. So more folks looking for jobs at that point, and not necessarily there being as many jobs in return, or at least aren't paying as well. And so this is where this supply and demand kind of comes in, which is if you have a larger supply of people who want to be employed, but a lower portion of jobs that are available for those folks, then things aren't in the favor of the employee, but in the employer. And so oftentimes the way our market corrects in capitalistic scenarios is that the person who has the upper hand kind of gets the benefit out of this deal. So when there's a high unemployment rate, the employers are going to be trying to take advantage of that and maybe pay less, take back benefits, get those employees to work as hard as they can, as best as they can for as little as possible. And when power is in their hand, it's going to shift towards them and less pay away from the employees, and vice versa in the opposite scenario, where when there's a lot of jobs and companies can't wait to hire people or they can't hire fast enough, then they start to bump up those wages and incentives. So certainly it makes sense that these are correlated, but curious if they're going to kind of elaborate on how these things are connected, more so than the general correlation between wage growth and unemployment.
Bargaining chip any employee has to getting wage growth is going to the boss and saying, I'm going to go somewhere else unless I make more money. And that's just not a credible threat when unemployment is high. The only people whose wages are not very affected by unemployment are like the 90th and 95th percentile. Like they don't need super low unemployment to get some consistent wage growth, but the middle class absolutely does.
This means the Federal Reserve's policy decisions that result in higher than necessary unemployment might be creating conditions that actively hold back wage growth for middle-class Americans. Location could be another factor.
There are other reasons for why we've seen less growth in the middle than, say, at the other parts of the distribution. Another one is just that people don't move as much as they used to.
The share of Americans on the move has declined over the years, from more than 20% in 1948 to just 8.7% in 2022.
That's actually an interesting piece of data that they just had right there, which is 20% to 10%. So again, to reference one of their other charts that they had, unemployment, for the most part, I think in COVID times, it maybe hit in the like 12 to 15% range for unemployment. That's obviously a very unique scenario where they were intentionally shutting down certain areas and certain businesses just completely weren't able to run at that point in time. But what they had referenced is that actually most of the time unemployment kind of hovers around like 3 to, let's say, 9 or maybe 10%. Um, and so that's where most of what we consider like 2008 recession or um, the dot-com bubble burst. These scenarios have all kind of fluctuated between this kind of like 3 and 9-ish% of unemployment. And so even at that scale, 5, 6, 7% is a huge shift for the population. So to put that into perspective here, it's slightly over a 10% shift. So this is basically like almost as large as the delta between how many folks are employed now versus how many folks were unemployed now versus how many folks were unemployed during COVID. And so 10% of the population is huge and impactful when you can see it day to day. So this is actually a pretty large number, and it might not appear that way at face value. So that's actually very interesting that it has dropped so meaningfully in that time frame.
In 1948 to just 8.7% in 2022. Between 1986 and 1997, almost 29% of job seekers relocated for new jobs. That number has fallen to just 1.6% in 2023. Location plays a crucial role in wages. Despite the surge in remote work during the COVID-19 pandemic, wages for remote and hybrid jobs haven't grown nearly as much as salaries for full-time in-office roles, with some research estimating that remote workers could earn up to 30% more if they came into the office 5 days a week.
So that's an interesting statistic as well. Again, I'll probably reference supply and demand here. I think this is a scenario where the competition for remote jobs is going to be so vast because obviously it includes everybody at kind of more of a global scale. Even when you're looking at like the confines of the US, and we can just say at our country scale. Because if you're competing in New York City with somebody who's in San Francisco, there's so many more folks who could potentially be up for these remote jobs. And so again, here's where supply and demand come into play, which is there's probably a higher demand for remote jobs than there are for in-person jobs. And so therefore, folks who are interested in the remote work are probably willing to kind of take or having to take kind of some concessions in pay in order to gain that benefit. Whereas the opposite is probably true for the in-office workers, which is if you're okay with working in office, you're likely going to probably have some expectation that there is some benefit there over working remotely, for instance, someplace else. And because more folks are interested in those remote jobs, there's probably less job seekers looking for those jobs that are 5 days in office. So this is where, for remote workers, it's probably shifted towards the employer who has kind of more power or kind of has the upper hand in that negotiation. Whereas it's probably the opposite way in the office workers, where they probably have a smaller footprint, especially if you're looking at only folks who are in the local area. I use New York and like San Francisco as an example there, but like you could be in a slightly smaller region. You could be in like Chicago or Washington, D.C. or Miami, Florida, or some other area that isn't going to be as large as New York City, or it could even be in a surrounding area. And so you're looking at a much smaller footprint and a much smaller population that you could be looking for potential employees, unless they are willing to move. And so again, this is where probably tied in with the moving data means that there's only so many folks who you're realistically looking at when you're looking at somebody who's local and willing to go into the office.
Decades ago, when I was a worker living in sort of a lower opportunity area, I would move to a higher productivity city, like maybe San Francisco or New York City or Los Angeles. And as a result, I'd be able to capture higher wages, gain more skills, and then move up the income distribution. Now there's a lot less people moving across areas to capture those opportunities. Real reason behind that is astronomical housing costs that are due to excessive regulations at local levels.
Home prices hit a record high in June 2024, with existing homes selling at a median price of $426,900. In line with typical seasonal trends, home prices declined in July and August, but still set new records for those months.
The overwhelming number of jobs in the U.S. are in places that have really not seen much construction of housing.
Some economists also argue that globalization has played a pivotal role in stalling wage growth for middle-income Americans.
The expansion of trade with countries that have much lower wages, I think that was always going to provide quite a bit of pressure on the U.S. middle class because so much of that trade runs through like the manufacturing sector, which is where a lot of middle class jobs have been.
Between 1995 and 2013, trade with lower wage nations like Mexico and China reduced wages for workers without a four-year degree by roughly 5.6%, or about $2,000 per year for workers at the median wage. However, whether globalization is actually to blame has long been debated, with some research suggesting it has had a minimal impact on wage and income inequality.
It's not just that we did it, we also did it on terms set by trade agreements that really, people call them free trade agreements. They weren't. They were basically exercises in selective protectionism. Who gets protected, who doesn't? Middle-class workers were not protected. Corporations, especially corporations like software companies, drug makers, Hollywood, were all protected in these trade agreements. So, it's not just the natural flow of globalization, it's how policy shaped how it happened and who got protected and who didn't.
Regulatory policies can limit the power workers have within the labor market.
We've seen this huge decline in the share of workers who are represented by a union in the U.S. economy.
In 1983, roughly 1 in 5 Americans were in a union. By 2020,
Yeah, so this is great data that they are bringing here. CNBC, I'm a huge fan of, especially videos like this. They bring in so much data, and I feel like they are actively trying to inform their viewers. And so just want to call out how great they are. But back on this scenario, unions membership has drastically dropped. Obviously, some of the key players in unions that you would think of as applicable in these scenarios, like an Amazon, for instance, or other manufacturers like maybe like a Tesla or other areas, they oftentimes actually are fairly anti-union. Obviously, publicly they say they are pro-union, and I think both of those cases, but have actually behind the scenes worked towards undermining union assembly because, again, unions were made in order to help promote the well-being of the employees and basically to kind of curtail the negative effects of the supply and demand aspect that exists between employee and employer. And so there's definitely been a noticeable drop in union membership to the point where so few folks are part of a union. I think while I don't necessarily work in those industries, I don't think I know of a single person that I can say with certainty, or certainly not a large percentage. Maybe I know like 1 or 2 people who are actually participating in a union, but that's probably a fraction, probably 5 or less percent of the folks who I know. And so here they're saying it's about 10% on this chart. So it's basically been cut in half over this time frame from 1983 to 2023. So over this 40-year span, and unions were a great benefit to employees and have put in a lot of aspects like safety regulations, especially in the manufacturing space. We do still see this be successful in certain other areas, like folks are probably somewhat still recalling kind of like the writers' strikes or some of the actors' strikes that have happened somewhat recently. And so this is a scenario of these things working well, or maybe a school system like a teachers union that exists in maybe your local area. So these all exist in order to help ensure that the employees are treated fairly to some extent. And so they work again together in order to basically petition their employers and kind of negotiate on behalf of the general good for that segment. But in many cases, some big companies are actually trying to prevent this from being the case. And I would definitely say I don't see that much prevalence of unionization in the industries that I work the closest with.
2023, that number had dropped to 1 in 10. Full-time salaried union workers made about 15.9% more compared to non-union workers in 2023.
single worker going to the boss and saying, you need to give me a raise or I'll leave, there's not a lot of force behind that threat. When you've got a union doing it, there's a lot of force behind that threat. And you look at countries that look like us, so they've experienced the same globalization shocks, like the UK, Canada, Germany. Their unionization rates have fallen a bit since the peaks, but nowhere like the US fall. And then if you just sort of look at the facts on the ground over the past 30 to 40 years in the US, there's just clearly been a growing employer hostility to union organizing efforts.
They just want their profits high.
Among U.S. employers involved in unionization efforts, more than 4 out of 10 have been charged with violating federal laws during their union.
Yeah, so they're kind of alluding to it. I don't know if they're going to call out Amazon specifically, but in that video, they just kind of highlighted Amazon as a reference here. But this is something that definitely a number of folks have seen, is that employers are actively preventing this, again, because as they highlighted, unionized employees generally make more money, they have better benefits. And so an employer is not incentivized to allow that to happen, because basically what an employer hears in a cynical sense is, I need to pay more for less work, potentially, is what that means to an employer. Where obviously for us employees, that means fair pay for fair work. And the definition of what that means is different for different folks. And so they're not particularly incentivized. So we'll see how deep they go into the employers and how they're preventing unions from being formed.
Union election campaigns. And 1 out of 5 campaigns involved the charge that a worker was illegally fired for trying to organize a union.
Just the number of registered unfair labor practices that are firing people trying to organize a union have risen a lot. And one thing that's happened to enable that is, one, there's been a change in management norms, I think, but also all of the penalties for doing that, just they're not adjusted for inflation often. They've always been pathetically low. If you fire a worker for trying to organize a union, the penalty you face is you have to pay them back wages after the whole legal process grinds out and they come back to your company. But then you're allowed to deduct any wages they made in the meantime at another job they got. And so firing workers trying to form a union is just a pretty small cost of business. And it pays off great because unions really do raise wages, and that's not something employers want.
The decline of union membership isn't the only roadblock for growing the middle-class workers' income.
So in many cases, you'll have policies at a local level and a firm-specific level that cut off wage growth.
There's occupational licensing in different areas of the country, which can make it harder to start a new career.
While estimates vary, between a fifth and a third of all American workers are required to have a license to work. A study found that jobs in states requiring a license earn about 8% more compared to the same jobs in states that don't. However, just a 10% increase in licensed workers with similar skills is estimated to reduce all workers' wages down by 1.6 to 2.3%. Economists estimate that eliminating occupational licensing can reduce earnings inequality within occupations by 2 to 4%. While licensing might appear to be necessary for some professions with health and safety concerns, researchers found no statistical difference in health and safety quality outcomes between states that require licensing compared to states that don't.
To be a hairstylist in some places, for instance, you need a license from the state to actually do that. So there's a lot of these types of occupations that really are not dangerous and don't need state licensing to be made safe. But nonetheless, we have these licenses in place probably to protect the incumbents and make it harder for new entrants to come in, sort of do their own business or start this new career field and thereby increase their wages.
I think as important as the middle class is economically, and I think it's incredibly important, it is just the entire game for, I think, politics.
Both political parties in the United States recognize the economic pressures facing U.S. families. There's different visions on how to intervene effectively.
I was raised as a middle-class kid, and I am actually the only person on this stage who has a plan that is about lifting up the middle class and working people of America.
For Kamala Harris, strengthening wages is about two things. It's about boosting the industries where wage workers work. So she wants to build on the Biden administration's infrastructure investments to onshore domestic manufacturing and construction and boost those domestic industries. She also has a huge focus on strengthening union protections.
You better thank unions.
She wants to raise the minimum wage, end taxes on tips, which is a policy that Trump first proposed and she later echoed, Trump's proposals to strengthen wages for the middle class, in many ways it mirrors what Harris has proposed, which is to onshore domestic manufacturing and construction. He has proposed doing so by instating a hardline tariff policy.
Former President Trump publicly denounced globalism during his time in office, blaming the financial struggles faced by many Americans on it.
We're doing tariffs on other countries. Other countries are going to finally, after 75 years, pay us back for all that we've done for the world.
He's faced some backlash from economists about how this could threaten to reheat the consumer price spikes that are just beginning to cool, but he sees it as a long-term strategy to bring domestic jobs back to the US, boost manufacturing in the US. So in some ways, this is his plan to grow the US economy as a whole and let the effects sort of ripple into the middle class as a result.
Another major difference is in the candidate's proposed tax policies.
So before they get into the tax policies, I think definitely those were interesting scenarios that they highlighted. So Kamala Harris working towards basically strengthening unions obviously makes a lot of sense. That would give the power back to employees. I think they just highlighted earlier in the video that having these illegal practices right now isn't really that negative of an aspect, and I think it is an unfortunate aspect of kind of how businesses are run, is that likely there's some portion that is expected for some type of legal action, whether that's from your employees, from your customer base, because somebody's going to be unhappy at some point. But sometimes this kind of gets overdone into where you sort of accept that it's just the cost of doing business is to kind of take advantage of your employees or potentially your customers. And that's definitely a very negative aspect that isn't kind of put in check at this point in time, as they already highlighted 1 in 5 folks who are trying to form a union are illegally fired, which shouldn't happen. That should be like 1 in 100 maybe. So 1 in 5 is certainly is too high of a number, because even if you're an employee and you're at one of these companies and you see somebody get fired and you need your job, especially in times like these where inflation is high and maybe employment is going up, you're not going to want to risk your job, even if you think you're being paid unfairly, because being paid unfairly might be better for you than being paid nothing or not having a job if you have a family or other responsibilities that you need to deal with. And so certainly that's an interesting aspect of how it works, and I think definitely a proponent of that idea. I think the more we can kind of offset these areas of certain things, I think have lower ramifications of allowing this sort of supply and demand back and forth in these negotiations to be negatively impacting to folks. And some of them are so fundamental to how we live and how we function as a society. Like I think healthcare as an example, which is supply and demand and this capitalistic version of it. That's going to be a really tough spot. If you're choosing between living or dying, you're going to be incentivized to give as much money as humanly possible to live under that context. And so in these vulnerable situations, this is exactly where hopefully regulation and the government steps in. I would say same thing for employment, which is if you are vulnerable to potentially be laid off and you can't support your family, then that's a really tough scenario to be in. And this is presumably not a place where you want supply and demand and power to just be completely overrun by one party or your employer in this scenario. On the tariff front, I certainly heard Trump mention this tariff scenario. He highlighted long-term growth. So again, a scenario that this could potentially make some sense in is like how a lot of things get manufactured overseas, as they highlighted earlier. This disincentivizes folks within the US to continue manufacturing. If there's so much specialization that's happening overseas, then those companies are getting better and better at manufacturing, and then it kind of gives them a lead over folks who are manufacturing here in the US. And so if you're going to become a new manufacturer in the US, then you're kind of competing with these giants in this space, and it gets harder and harder for you to compete or even want to try to compete. And so it becomes this kind of like negative feedback cycle for the growth of manufacturing within the US if a lot of it gets pushed offshores or in any environment like this. But then obviously the price should hopefully get cheaper and cheaper in those other countries as they specialize in it. So you can add these tariffs to kind of balance things out cost wise. So you can offset basically how cheap something might be offshores by adding a tariff onto it and then basically upping the price that the consumer would see. And therefore, this kind of forces more even competition. So then, therefore, the incentive for somebody in the US to make these jobs would be higher. And that could theoretically create a scenario where once they do it, they could then specialize and improve and optimize their flow to the point where they're more easily competing with other folks. But having that first foot in the door could help them. But that certainly is a much longer term view. That would likely be many, many years for something like that to happen. And that would likely require many presidents of the United States to uphold those tariffs for that to really be seen. So interesting option so far. Curious to see what they're going to say about Texas.
I have a plan to give startup businesses $50,000 tax deduction to pursue their ambitions, their innovation, their ideas, their hard work. I have a plan, $6,000 for young families for the first year of your child's life to help you in that most critical stage of your child's development.
She has proposed offsetting the costs of her tax relief proposals by increasing corporate tax hikes and tax hikes on the wealthy. She's proposed increasing the corporate tax rate to 28%. She wants to increase the tax rate on long-term capital gains also to 28%.
Everybody knows I'm an open book. Everybody knows what I'm going to do. Cut taxes very substantially and create a great economy like I did before.
So in 2017, we had the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which substantially lowered the corporate tax. And there's varying degrees about how much people believe that translated into higher wages, but there's a pretty strong consensus that lowering the corporate tax actually increased worker wages.
Some research has estimated that the 2017 tax cut led to a $750 increase in annual pay for full-time employees in 2017 dollars. Opposing research argues that the earning gains were concentrated in the top 10%, with no changes in earnings for the bottom 90%.
Trump's framing of boosting the middle class by boosting the economy as a whole doesn't offer sort of the targeted approach that Harris has brought to her economic platform. Her policy page is consistently drawing back to the middle class, saying how, her tax relief programs will benefit the middle class specifically. Trump is focused on growth and growing the US economy as a whole and letting the success of that policy trickle down to the middle class.
Policy.
Yeah, so to elaborate on that a little bit more, I think a few things that I've heard from Trump overall is he has this sort of trickle down mentality of if you make things beneficial for companies or for this particular set of folks, then that will eventually kind of work its way into other aspects and eventually make it there. So I think he had a similar opinion on like inflation, for instance, which is I think he had a stance on energy. And if you could make that cheaper, then it'd be cheaper to transport those goods, maybe make those goods. And then therefore, eventually there could be a price drop for the consumer. But again, that assumes a series of events occurs and that also the people who are benefiting from that scenario, which are like the businesses in this case, actually pass those savings along to other folks like their employees or their customers. They had previously highlighted, for instance, the top 10% of earners versus the bottom 90% of earners being impacted by that growth. So something that is likely possible, while they didn't explicitly cover that, is if we think about like the top 10% of a company, for instance, like the executives, as an example, or senior leadership to some extent, these folks are the ones who oftentimes are more incentivized by the outcome of the company and how it is progressing. So this could take part in maybe a larger percentage in bonuses, maybe larger equity grants, a variety of options here. And so this is where, as you're a kind of middle class worker or somebody who's lower on the totem pole at one of these companies, you're likely getting all of your compensation paid in a regular salary or hourly wage. But as you progress up, basically these pay structures shift towards outcomes of the business. And so, likely, if you're a CEO or something like that, a large portion of what you get paid is potentially stock or a bonus based off of how profitable the company is. And so, therefore, if your company has lower taxes and everything else stays the same, you don't pay your employees more, you don't charge less for your goods, you generally have everything stay the same 1 year to the next and just taxes got reduced, then there's extra cash in your pockets as a business. And so therefore the business has become more successful. And then the folks who get compensated based off of the success of the company would likely be the ones who benefit from that. And so that's likely where that data from the top 10% impacting coming from, which is the folks who are more incentivized by the outcome of the company. Having less taxes, the companies are inherently doing better. Therefore, they get paid more versus the everyday individual who likely doesn't have those type of incentive structures.
Matters so much in generating like the wage income that is the lifeblood of the middle class. I think a lot of people just haven't made that connection between the wages I earn and what is the policy environment. When they think policy, they think direct benefits that come from the government, but a lot of what the government does conditions how fast their wages grow in the labor market, and yet the connection hasn't been made on how policy affects them in the most important way they earn income in the labor market.
I'm not hopeful that the presidential platforms themselves will solve the woes of the middle class, but nor do I think the federal government is in the front seat on solving them anyway. But they are taking it seriously. I mean, hopefully those problems will be made more transparent, will shine a light on them, and then through a combination of federal action, state and local action, that we will see some of these improvements that we need in terms of less regulation and some targeted support where it makes sense to help middle class families thrive.
Well, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw, please hit like or subscribe. I'll see you around.